And that is a wrap on the GMTK Game Jam for 2019. This was our biggest jam yet, with over 2,000 games submitted for entry. Now is the time for everyone, those who took part in the jam and those who did not, to head on over to itch.io, play as many games as you can, and rate them. You should be judging them based on their ideas, design, and execution, but don't be swayed by pretty art and music. This is all about game design. Once I've got enough ratings, I'll be playing the top-rated games and picking my personal favourites for a video on this channel. Look out for that later this month. I'll also be live streaming some games throughout the week here on YouTube. For now though, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who took part. I hope it was a useful exercise and I look forward to playing some of your games in the coming days.